Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku Got the Omnitrix Part 4. Last time on the What If, Izuku met Azimuth, who tracked down the Omnitrix's signal to Izuku's world. And when they met, they made a deal, which was if Izuku won the sports festival, he would be able to keep the Omnitrix, which Izuku was able to win, allowing him to keep the Omnitrix and gain 3 more transformations, with some being Lodestar, Feedback, and Guttrot. And during the hero work studies, Izuku and Todoroki came across the hero killer standing above Ida about to kill him, and with the help of Fast Track, Izuku was able to quickly deal with Stain, and Stain was just taken to the while Ida and Native were taken to the doctors to get patched up. So now that that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we begin this What If the day after the Hosu attack, and Izuku and Todoroki were currently in the main room for Endeavor's agency, having a meeting with the head of the Hosu police department, since the two weren't that injured from the attack, so they were able to be easily patched up, and the head was telling them that they just attacked a villain without the orders of a pro hero without a license, but instead of them just being punished, he decided to give them an option, which was if they give most of the credit to Endeavor, then they won't be punished. And it's most of the credit since a lot of civilians saw Izuku helping Ida and Native, so they know that Izuku had something to do with the Stain attack, or they can get all the credit and face punishment. And of course, the two took the first option, and after the meeting, the two went back to training, and they continued to train until the internships were done. So now we skip a couple of weeks, and by this point, Class 1A has taken the real part of the exams, with everyone getting the same score since Izuku is forbidden from using Brainstorm to help him, since they wanted to test his normal intelligence. So now we skip to the students versus teachers test, and all the teams will be the exact same as in the canon. So when everything was ready, Bakugo and Izuku's test against All Might began, and at the start of the test, Izuku slammed his hand on Fast Track, trying to get a quick victory, and when the flash of light was gone, Izuku was Fast Track. So Izuku then began to run to the exit, but before he was able to get to the exit, a gust of wind, strong enough to destroy buildings and nearby roads, hit Izuku head on, launching him back somewhere in the middle of the fake city. And when he was able to see again, Izuku tried to run to the exit again, but before he was actually able to run, All Might was able to find him, and he was able to grab Izuku by his arm, and he slammed him to the ground. Then before he could do anything else, Bakugo appeared and he tried to fire an explosion at All Might, which didn't even make him flinch. And he grabbed Bakugo by his face and he slammed him to the ground as well, right next to Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku tried to run to Bakugo and carry him away. But before he could even reach Bakugo, Izuku was grabbed by All Might on his face, and he was chucked into the air around 30 feet up. And while he was being flung, Izuku tried to figure out a way to slow down his descent. So he tried to spin his arms to try to create a small gust of wind to slow him down, but Izuku wasn't able to create one strong enough, so he landed face first to the ground. But even with all this damage, Izuku was able to still stand. And the second he did, he ran at All Might, and he launched a barrage of attacks at All Might's stomach, which did seem to do damage, but they didn't make All Might fall. And after around 30 seconds, All Might was able to punch Izuku in the gut at full power. So that launched Izuku into a nearby building, and when he stopped moving, he transformed back to normal, since he was too injured. So then All Might began to focus his attention to Bakugo, and after a minute of fight, All Might launched Bakugo at the same building that Izuku was in. But luckily, before he actually hit the building, Bakugo fired an explosion, which cushioned his fall. He then ran to where Izuku was, and he grabbed him. And before All Might could follow them, Bakugo fired multiple explosions, making a smoke screen. And in the smoke, Bakugo was able to carry Izuku away. And after a minute, Bakugo was able to find a place to hide, which was a rooftop a couple of buildings away. He then began to shout and slap Izuku to make him wake up. And after a couple of seconds, Izuku woke up. So now by this point, 10 minutes has passed, leaving only 20 minutes left for the two to get to the gate. So they then began to try to come up with a plan to get to the exit. And while they were thinking, Izuku looked around to see what alien would be best. And after a couple of seconds, his eyes landed on an electric pole. So the two then came up with a plan to use Bakugo as bait, while Izuku runs to the exit using the power lines as Buzzshock. So when they were done planning, Izuku slammed his hand on Buzzshock, but when the flash of light was gone, Izuku was feedback. But even with his failed transformation, the two continued with the plan. So Bakugo flew towards All Might as fast as he could, and he began to fight using everything he had, while Izuku landed on the electric line, and he began to run as fast as he could, and since he was filled with electricity, it gave him super speed. So after around 5 minutes, Izuku was just about at the end of the city, and he was close to the gate. But right before Izuku went through the gate, he saw a Bakugo pinned with All Might standing above him. So Izuku then charged up his electricity into his fingers, and he jumped onto a nearby electric pole, and he ran on the lines towards the two, and before All Might could dodge, Izuku shot out 2 electric attacks, which hit All Might directly. But since he was holding onto Bakugo, it hit him as well, but just not as much. And since All Might was hit, he was stunned for a couple of seconds. And making the most of this, Izuku grabbed onto Bakugo with his antennas, and he began to run to the gate as fast as he could, by running on the nearby lines again, and they were almost able to make it. But before they could, All Might got back to normal, and he ran at the two as fast as he could. And when he got to Izuku, he fired another punch, which flung the two off of the line, and they were flung to a nearby building. And right before they hit the building, Bakugo fired an explosion towards the building, cushioning the impact again. So when they made contact, they weren't so injured. So after a couple of seconds, Izuku got back up, and he made sure Bakugo was okay. So the two then jumped out of the hole that they just created, and what waited for them when they landed was All Might. And seeing this, Izuku charged up his fingertips, and he shot out a beam of electricity at All Might, which stunned him for a second. So Izuku then tackled All Might, and he told Bakugo to run. And at first he didn't want to, but after Izuku shouted it again, Bakugo began to run to the exit, using his explosions to propel him faster. So Izuku and All Might began to fight, with Izuku using his electric abilities to stand his ground. But after Izuku began to lose electricity, All Might was slowly able to gain the upper hand, and eventually he was able to grab onto Izuku's ears, and he flung Izuku into another building. But by the time Izuku hit the building, an alarm rang throughout the entire fake city, announcing that the students have passed the exams. So now we skip to the next day, and Class 1A was told that even if they failed the exams, they will still be going to the summer camp. And when class was over, Class 1A decided that they wanted to go shopping for gear for the camp. And after a couple of minutes after getting to the mall, Izuku was all by himself, since everyone split up to buy the things that they wanted. But before he was able to make it to a store, someone in a hoodie put his arm around Izuku, and he told him it's been a while since he's last seen him, since the last time they met was in the US. And hearing this, Izuku began to recognize the man. It was the guy with the hand mask. Izuku then went for the omnitrix, but before he was even able to press the button, Shigaraki began to tell Izuku that he has an army of Nomus on standby, stronger than the one he had before, and he told him that if he pressed the button, he will warp them all there. He then asked Izuku how many people are going to die because of him, and hearing this, Izuku has to believe his bluff, just in case he's not lying. So Izuku then takes his arm away from the omnitrix. And Shigaraki seeing this then takes Izuku to a nearby bench, and the two began to talk, and eventually Shigaraki began to realize that All Might was the root of all of his problems, and he began to thank Izuku. But before he was done, Ochako showed up, and seeing this, Shigaraki took his arm off Izuku, and he began to walk into the crowd of people. And not wanting to summon an army of Nomus, Izuku stayed where he was, and a couple of hours later the mall was shut down, and Izuku was taken to the police department for questioning. So now we skip to the next day, and when Izuku woke up, he found a text message from Asmus, telling Izuku to come to his shack. And when Izuku got there, he found a stump and a whiteboard, with Asmus standing right next to it on another stump. And when Asmus noticed Izuku, Asmus pointed to the stump and he told Izuku to sit. And when he sat down, Asmus congratulated Izuku for passing the final exams, but he told him that he was watching, and he told Izuku that he could have done better if he had better handling on his transformations. And confused what Asmus was talking about, Izuku asked how can he get better, and Asmus in response told Izuku that he will learn how to go from alien to alien. And after a couple of hours, Izuku learned how to transform from alien to alien. The only problem was, every time he transformed, he would lose time as an alien. And when Izuku was able to get a good grasp on transforming, Asmus told Izuku that he had learned what he needed to learn, so he told Izuku to leave. So Izuku then spent the rest of the time before the camp learning how to transform. So now we skip to when Class 1A stops at a mountain, and when they get out of the bus, they see the WWPC, who welcomed them to the camp. They then point to the campgrounds, but before anyone could question why she was telling them that, Pixie Bop began to move the ground around them, and after a couple of seconds, she launched them off the cliff. And when the class hit the ground, she told them to get to the camp as fast as they can. And when Class 1A began to run, monsters made out of rocks began to attack. And Izuku used his omnitrix to turn himself into goop, and he became very acidic, and he began to melt the rocks. And after a couple of hours, Class 1A was able to get to the campgrounds, with everyone tired and dirty, Izuku included. So now we skip to the next day, and everything with Koda still happens the same, so Izuku knows about his parents. And when it was around 8 AM, Class 1A began to train, with everyone doing the same training, except Izuku had to fight against everyone who was a melee fighter, since it allowed them to practice against different opponents, and it allowed Izuku to practice against other people, and it allowed him to get better at adapting to situations. And this continued for the whole day, and when they were done training and were eating, Izuku noticed that Koda wasn't there, so he grabbed a plate and he transformed into Astrodactyl, and he flew around searching for Koda. And after around 5 minutes, Izuku found Koda on a cliff, and when Izuku got to him, he turned back to normal, and the two began to talk about why Izuku wants to be a hero, and Koda just tells Izuku that he's throwing his life away. And after around 10 minutes, Izuku puts down the plate of food, and he transforms into Fast Track, and he then ran back to the camp. So now we skip to the next day, and Izuku did the same training he did the first day. And when the training was done, the WWPC decided that they should do a test of courage, with all the groups being the same as in the canon, with Izuku being alone. But before he was able to go in, he and other people outside the forest could see that the forest was covered in blue flames. Then two villains start to walk out of the forest, and they begin to fight Pixie Bop, Mandalay, and Tiger, while the students start to run to find a place to hide. But before Izuku did anything, he remembered that Koda is probably on the cliff, so he tells Mandalay where he is going, and she gives him a nod. So Izuku then tried to go for fast track to get there quickly, and when the flash of light was gone, he was fast tracked. Izuku then ran to a cliff as fast as he could, and when he got there after 30 seconds, he saw someone almost punch Koda, but before they were able to, Izuku rushed at the villain, but right before he made contact, he transformed into feedback, and when the flash of light was gone, Izuku was feedback, so he then hit the guy in the gut, and with the momentum he had and the super strength he has now, he delivered a powerful punch out of nowhere, and in response, the man leans over for a second, but he quickly picks himself back up. He then told Izuku that he was on the list. The man then asked where was Bakugo, but before Izuku could respond, Muscular tried to hit Izuku, but Izuku was able to avoid the attack just in time, and seeing that it was a melee fighter, Izuku put more electricity into his hand, and he put his hands directly onto Muscular's chest, and he fired out as much electricity as he could, not enough to cause anything too serious, but he used just enough so Muscular began to have muscle spasms. Izuku then transformed into Guttrot, and he shot out a sleeping gas, and when Muscular smelled it, he passed out instantaneously. Izuku then transformed back to normal, and he asked if Koda was okay, which he was. Izuku then began to think for 2 minutes about what he should do, since he wants to help Bakugo, but he still needs to worry about Koda, and he shouldn't just bring him to the villains. So Izuku then transformed into Brainstorm, and he began to calculate a rough estimate of where Bakugo was, since he knew the route of the test of courage, and he knows how far Bakugo should have walked if he went at an average pace. So after a minute, he knew the general area of where Bakugo was. So Izuku then turned into fast track and he picked up Koda, and he began to run to the camp. And on his way, he came across Aizawa, who when he saw Izuku told him to give Mandalay a message. So after Izuku handed Koda to him, Izuku ran back to the camp. And when he got there, he saw Mandalay and Tiger still fighting the villains. So Izuku then ran to the villain Mandalay was fighting, which was Spinner, and he hit the villain in the gut, which flung him into a nearby tree. And while he was getting up, Izuku told Mandalay that Koda was okay, and he told her the message that Aizawa gave him, which was he gave the students permission to fight. So Mandalay then sent out a message to all of the students, and when she did, Izuku then ran to where he believed Bakugo was, and since he knew where Bakugo was, he didn't run into Tokoyami and Choji, and after around 3 minutes, Izuku was able to find Todoroki and Bakugo, and they were currently fighting the villain Moonfish. And when Izuku got there, he ran straight at Moonfish, and he hit him in the face, launching him into a tree, and before he was able to get up, Todoroki froze him in place. Izuku then told the two to get out of the way, and when they were, he turned into Guttrot again, and he shot out a sleeping gas, which made Moonfish pass out, and when Izuku saw this, Izuku sucked up the gas and he turned it back to normal, and after all of this, the omnitrix started to flash red, and after a couple of beeps, Izuku turned back to normal. Izuku then told Bakugo and Todoroki what he heard from the villain he fought a couple of minutes ago, and after some talking, they decided to walk back to the camp, with Izuku and Bakugo in the back, while Todoroki led the group, and after a couple of minutes, the omnitrix turned green, but before he could question why it did, Izuku got sucked into a marble along with Bakugo, and after a couple of seconds, Todoroki noticed that both of them were quiet, so he turned around, and when he did, he saw no one, so he began to look around, and after a couple of seconds, he found someone standing in the trees, who then introduced himself as Mr. Compress, and when he was done with the introduction, he showed 4 marbles in his hands, and when Todoroki looked at them, he saw Izuku, Bakugo, Tokoyami, and Choji. Todoroki then fired a wave of flames at the villain, but the villain was able to dodge it with ease. Then the villain began to run away, and seeing this, Todoroki followed the villain until eventually he came across Sue stuck to a tree, and Ochako getting her blood drained by another villain. And seeing Todoroki, the villain decided that it was too much trouble, so she got off of Ochako, and she began to skip away. And once Todoroki got Sue off the tree, he tells the two to follow him, and while they were running, he explains everything that just happened, but after a couple of minutes, they start to lose sight of the villain, so Todoroki then tells Ochako to make him weightless, and to grab onto him, and when she does, he tells Sue to chuck him, and when she did, the two began to rocket towards the villain, and when they were close, Ochako gave them weight again, and to boost their speed, Todoroki used his fire side to make them go faster, and after around 30 seconds, the two made impact with the villain, and they landed on top of him, and when they look around, they find out that they are at the rendezvous point for the villains, so there was a giant portal and a couple of villains. But before they could do anything, Mr. Compress threw the marbles towards the group, and he turned himself into a marble. Then when he was a couple of feet away, he turned himself back to normal. Then the two groups began to fight, and after a bit of time, Mr. Compress shows the 4 marbles in his mouth. But when he reveals them, a laser beam comes out of nowhere and it hits him in the face, making him drop the 4 marbles. And seeing this, Ochako and Todoroki run to the fallen marbles, and since there was 4 of them, they were able to grab 2, too, and the 2 people they were able to grab were Tokoyami and Izuku. And to check what they had, Mr. Compress turned everyone back to normal. And with Izuku back to normal, he slammed his hand on the omnitrix, and he went for fast track again. But when the flash of light was gone, Izuku was upchuck. But even with this, Izuku ran at Dabi, who was holding Bakugo by his neck, and he tried to get to him in time by using his tongue to push away the villain from the portal. But Dabi was able to avoid the attack, and he fired a wave of flames, which made Izuku have to stop. Then Dabi started to walk slowly into the portal with Bakugo going with him. Then the portal surrounded Shoji, who was being held by Mr. Compress. Then hours later, ambulances arrived to take the injured people to the hospital, and the cops arrived to take the villains to jail. And that's where I'm going to leave the what if. I hope you enjoyed it. And you may be asking, why did I let Izuku and Tokoyami be chosen? Well, the thing is, I did it at random. I was like, I want to do something weird, so I decided to put all 4 names into a spin wheel, then I spun it, and the 2 names were Tokoyami and Izuku. So if you're questioning why I'm letting Izuku not be taken, that's the reason. Just pure chance. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.